Hey guys, and good morning. Welcome back to B73. It's Tom here. And today I'm going to be taking you through a pretty standard 4-sector day flying around Australia. It's going to take about some 10 hours. It's coming up on 5 a.m. And this is really kind of the bread and butter of what a regular sort of short haul domestic day looks like for a pilot in Australia, I guess. So, of course we do other international things. That's why, the designation of the job is short haul. It's not, domestic ops per se. It's short haul, meaning that, the range of the aeroplane sits around that 6-ish hour distance. But of course, that means that the majority of what we're going to do flying 737 around Australia is going to be domestic because it's such a massive continent. So today it's going to be Sydney to Melbourne, back to Sydney, then up to Brisbane, and then finishing back in Sydney finally. And I guess one of the key attitudes I try and have about these days, because they are big. There's one of the bigger days that you can really do with flight duty limitations, is to sort of pace yourself. I remember coming from international ops to short haul. It's very, there's a temptation to be rushed because short haul by nature is very, very fast paced compared to international. There's a lot of things happening. There's a lot of stakeholders trying to get your way, keep the on-time performance. And I think, having done it for a few years now, the way I try and come into these days is to, first off, do a little bit of planning at home the night before, if you can. And it helps at the moment because Melbourne's got a lot of works that they're doing to their taxiways, and getting that sort of pre-reading done the night before really helps with the amount of information you have to process in the morning, bright and early on the day. DC panel, battery on. And normally we'd want ground power, but we don't have that today, so we'll do a quick fire test. Camera cut out here, but without AC power, basically we come down, do our fire test, come back up here and get the APU going so that we can get some AC power. Once the APU is started, get the APU generators on, and that'll power up the aeroplane with this AC power, and we continue the setup. Bit of weather. Alright guys, here we are. Same tunnel, opposite side of the road as where we were some 11 hours, 15 minutes ago. 4 sectors done, Sydney, Melbourne, back to Sydney, up to Brisbane and back to Sydney again. And I thought, in the context of what happened today, what might be good to talk about is energy management. And that is because on the last approach, which was one of my legs, we had a situation where basically Sydney was light and variable winds, a little bit of crosswind, but the thing to be aware of when you see those kinds of conditions is a late runway change. And probably one of the worst times you can get this is as you're approaching top descent. So you've got a VNAV path calculated, you've got your arrival, your star, as well as your approach loaded. And that would dictate a perfect time where you would descend, which would give you close to an idle descent 3-degree profile, with sufficient time to slow down and configure as you get down to around 5,000 feet. And as things were in Sydney, of course we had to get a runway change. And that wasn't the only one we had today, actually. We had two. There was that one, we had another one in Brisbane. We had some interesting things happening in Melbourne as well that I'll talk about after this. But why does having a runway change impact your descent profile so much? And the reason for this is really it comes down to total energy. And total energy is, it's a concept and a topic that probably doesn't get spoken about as much these days because our flight computers are so good at programming and managing our descents that it can be a little bit, or it's easy to become complacent and just allow the airplane to fly the VNAV profile. That's why they call us children of the magenta line. The magenta line being basically the computer generated LNAV track, which is the track we follow laterally, as well as the VNAV profile, which is a vertical profile that the flight computer manages for us. And a simple thing to remember with that when calculating, how many miles do we need to get down from our cruising altitude to the ground, including configuration. And this is something that really everyone learns about when they start flying really any airplane. Depending on the category, there'll be different formulas that people will use, but typically it's 3 to 1 plus a buffer to be able to slow down. So if we just use really easy numbers, say we're at 30,000 feet, 3 times 30 is 90, so 90 miles. And that's a feet to nautical miles conversion. And then we'll add a buffer depending on how much we need to slow down. And typically if we descend at 280 knots or close to econ speed, that's pretty common for a jet. To get from 280 down to 250 knots, which is the speed we need to be below 10,000 feet in most countries, it's around 10 miles. And then again from 250 down to minimum clean speed or flaps up speed, which is where we'd start configuring. We'd start taking flaps 1 or depending on the airplane. It'd be another 10 nautical miles. So in that example we use 30 times 3, 90 plus 10 plus 10, so it'd be 110 nautical miles. Now this all goes out the window, not the math, not the formula, but that calculation goes out the window when you lose track miles. So the classic example today is coming from the north, coming from Brisbane, and you expect that you're going to be landing on one of the runways 3-4, either left or right. And to get positioned to the south to be able to do a north-facing landing, you obviously have to go all the way back around the side of Sydney, turn around, do a 180-degree turn, and then land on 3-4. The difference between that and doing a south-facing landing on one of the 1.6s works out to be about 30 or 40 nautical miles in track miles that are different to the amount of miles that you would fly just to get to that landing point. Now, before we said, say 30,000 feet, we wanted a descent point 110 nautical miles from our landing point. Now, if we lose 40 nautical miles, you can imagine it's a substantial difference in where the airplane is in terms of its altitude compared to where it should be. And the worst case scenario is when you're losing track miles, which is what happened today. So the interesting thing, you're cruising along, you've been given a clearance for your expected runway. It's kind of light variable winds, maybe a light crosswind, and just experience and sort of having an understanding of how winds can change gets you thinking, yeah, they might change runways, but at the moment we'll just proceed as normal. Just not every time, it might be 10% of the time where you've got light winds where they might change it. But in that case, today, that's exactly what happened. So cruising along, U8 is announced, look it up on Wi-Fi, and of course they say that about 3 or 4 minutes before our scheduled arrival time, they're going to be changing runways, which instantly, you're going, how do I get rid of this energy? So that's where we lead to total energy. So when we talk about total energy and energy in general, this is probably one of the core fundamentals of really physics of airplanes, and that is because there's 3 types of energy that you need to be considerate of when flying planes, and that is obviously a total, and then below that we've got our kinetic energy, which is how fast we're going, and that's measured in indicated airspeed. Second to that, we've got our potential energy, and potential simply means our altitude, which can be converted into kinetic energy by nosing over the airplane. So an example of, in a situation where you may convert or decide to convert potential energy into kinetic energy is, for example, having a loss of thrust on both engines, so a dual engine failure. If you were to lose both engines, obviously you're going to start losing airspeed. You've lost your thrust. And the only way to prevent the aeroplane from stalling, to continue flying the plane, you need to maintain airspeed. So in order to do that, you need to nose over the aeroplane and start converting that potential energy into kinetic. And then the last type of energy that I'll talk about is chemical energy. So that, for our case, is fuel, which we turn into both potential energy through climbing and gaining altitude, as well as kinetic energy by speeding up. So that's our energy. We're at a high position, we're in cruise, we need to get down, and basically what we're doing is we're saying we need to lose energy. And in a scenario where you thought you had more track miles to do so, and that gets shrunk by, say, 25%, all of a sudden you have excess energy. And really the first thing to think about is, how can we get rid of the energy? And the most immediate answer is, oh, well, if you've got too much energy, just add drag. And that's all well and good, and we have some options for that. If we talk about what sort of flight controls the aeroplane has, excluding the primaries, we've got flaps, we have speed brake, and we have gear. Those are sort of our 3 tools when we talk about energy management for the aeroplane. And let's have a discussion about what the use cases for those are and why we would or wouldn't use one of those 3 options when trying to decrease our energy in a scenario like we're talking about, where we're high on profile. We need to correct it, get down and re-intercept our 3-degree profile that we've calculated. So first, let's talk about flap and why we wouldn't use flap at a high altitude to get rid of energy. And first off, there's limitations on each of these flight controls, speeds and altitudes. And with flap, we're limited, for starters, to flight level 200, so 20,000 feet. Why do we have that limitation? Well, it's actually just because when Boeing was testing the 737, they had to pick a range of envelopes to test all of their flight controls, and above 20,000 feet, they just didn't test it. So, and this is not procedural, this is not written in the manuals, so don't take it as gospel. This is just me having a discussion about some of the history of development of the airframe. So the point of that is that above 20,000 feet, Boeing hasn't said that the flaps and slats will simply fall off the airplane. It's just that they've said that they haven't tested it. They don't know what the performance characteristics would be like, what the handling would be like. But that's already enough. The sheer fact that there's a limitation saying don't use these above 20,000 feet, we're not going to use them. The second thing to why we're not going to use slats and flaps to decrease energy and get down for drag purposes is because to get the flaps out, we have to slow down a lot. And it would help a lot more if we could do a diagram about the impact of descent speed and your glide path angle. But the easiest way to describe this would be if you had an aeroplane, and let's just use all all other variables equal. So our thrust is equal, we're cruising along, and then we go to idle. If we were to nose over an aeroplane, let's say we're cruising along at 280 knots at 25,000 feet. If we were to nose over an aeroplane at idle thrust, so thrust is constant, and we were to nose over until we reach 320 knots, let's just imagine that degree of airspeed increase. And it sucks I don't have a whiteboard here to describe it, but basically similar to the deck angle of what you could imagine for an emergency descent, where an airplane is trying to rapidly decrease in altitude for pressurization reasons or others. It'd be very steep. You'd be looking at the ground, right? If we were to compare that to a 250 knot descent, which you'd actually be decreasing in airspeed. Well, for starters, to get from 280 knots, which was our constant case airspeed, idle thrust, we'd actually be waiting a while for the speed to come back. We'd just hold pitch, speed would be bleeding off, and then eventually we'd hit 250, and we'd start a very gentle descent. These pitch and thrust settings I'm just making up in my head. I'm not referencing an actual in-flight performance table for this, it's just for discussion purposes. But the point that I'm getting at is, with a high indicated airspeed, we're going to have a steep deck angle looking towards the ground, and that's going to be reflected in our descent path angle. So, point being, flaps, would we use them? Well, first of all, we've got limitations on what altitude we can use them at, so it's only below 20,000 feet. And secondly, we'd be massively slowing down to use them, which means that, again, we'd be raising the nose to decrease our indicated airspeed, and then it'd be a very shallow descent path, because remember, we're also slowing down towards flaps up speed, which is a low drag speed, which again, if we have a low coefficient of drag, that's going to be shallowing our descent rate. The next device we'll talk about for increasing drag, but still why we wouldn't use it in a case of trying to get down faster and re-intercept our glide path. The next drag device that we'll talk about that could in theory be used to increase your drag, but in the case of trying to re-intercept our glide path, the next drag devices that we'll talk about are the gear, so the wheels, and why we wouldn't use them to increase our rate of descent in the case of re-intercepting our glide path or our descent angle. And the reasons for that are similar to flap in the sense that there are limitations for it as well. There's maximum speed limits for extended as well as retraction. And even though it has a significant impact on drag, and a really great demonstration of this that I've seen in the simulator is comparing a emergency descent in the 7.3 with the gear out versus the gear up. And it certainly does get you down, and it's something to be considered about if you want to increase your deck angle and your actual glide path angle, so you want a really steep angle of descent. But an outcome of dropping the gear at a very high cruise speed at a high altitude is the noise and the discomfort and the confusion that passengers would feel by opening the gear well at 30,000 feet and descending with this extremely loud noise of airflow getting disrupted around the main gears and the nose on the way down. So at such a high altitude, it'd be very, very uncommon for someone to drop the gear in order to re-intercept a glide path. And the reason is because we've got a far better device, which is the speed brake, and we'll talk about that in a moment. There are still scenarios where it is very useful to capture our descent path with the gear because of the high amount of drag that it produces. But it's usually around the, below 10,000 feet when you expect that once you drop the gear, you're probably going to be keeping it out. Just technique, but I've never seen, heard, or done anything where you would be dropping the gear followed by retracting it and then dropping it again whilst on approach. It'd be incredibly bizarre for passengers to hear that. I think the cabin crew would be very confused as well. It's not to say it's exceeding a limitation. So long as you're within the speed limits of the device, you can do it, but it'd be very rare. And the reason for that is because we have the speed brake. And the speed brake, it's a funny thing because historically, I think if we go back to 30, 40 years ago, there was probably a bit of a culture in the industry of if you're touching the speed brake, it means you made a mistake, because you're now using a device that wasn't necessary. It wasn't a compulsory device that you would have had to use during the configuration process anyway. The ideal approach would be perfect top of descent point, idle descent all the way down to close to the initial fix where you start configuring, and it's just a sequential sequence of events from the point where you take your first degree of flap. Now, I think times have changed a lot since then. I think the stigmas around using flap for energy management have largely gone. I don't really have any issue with using it. I use it regularly. You obviously try to foreshadow and understand your energy further in advance to avoid a scenario where it's a last minute correction where you need to use speed brake, but the device is there to be used. And in this scenario where, let's say you're 4,000 or 5,000 feet high because you've had a runway change, you've lost a lot of track miles, then speed brake's definitely one of the top options. The only other option that I'd put above using speed brake is increasing speed and converting your potential energy into kinetic energy. This really depends on the delta or the difference between what your FMC generated VNAV profile was like compared to what it currently is after the change. So let's say, for example, the FMC, the flight computer, you had programmed it saying that I want to fly a 280 knot descent. And let's say that air traffic control says there's no longer any speed constraints. You can fly at 310 knots if you want on the way down, and you don't have to decelerate till 5,000 feet or 6,000 feet. Well, the difference between 280 knots and 310 knots, that's 30 knots to play with that the FMC hasn't factored into its glide path angle yet. So in this scenario, it may be beneficial to, rather than launching for the speed brake, we've got 30 knots to play with, rather than descending at the speed that you told the flight computer you were going to do, you're going to fly faster than that, which means you're going to have a steeper deck angle, which means you're looking at the ground at a steeper angle, which therefore means that you're going to have a more steep, more aggressive descent path, enabling you to catch your new flight path that you've calculated, which will get you down a lot faster than otherwise just leaving it with the autopilot managing the VNAV profile. It's very easy with automation, particularly in the Boeings, where if you have last minute changes, you might be tracking direct somewhere, shortcuts, you might be told to go down earlier, go down later. It's not uncommon for these flight computers to basically just give up. If you give too many changes that are outside its envelope of what it says it can do, these AFDS modes, basically the FMC, will just give up and say, I can't do that. So sometimes awareness of energy management and just knowing where you are relative to where you need to be and what the aeroplane can do can really help you sort of save the day in these scenarios where otherwise the autopilot just wouldn't know what to do, wouldn't know how to get there. So anyway, that was a long-winded rant about total energy management, FMC profiles or flight computer profiles, and how through a general understanding and awareness of the basics, so there's the fundamentals that you learn in flying school about the 3 times profile plus a little bit for deceleration, can really help you have situational awareness of where the airplane is compared to where you want it to be. And regularly doing this, so even on a normal day where, let's say you're in an aeroplane that it's got FMC calculations for VNAV, even just making sure and doing quick math formulas to check that it's right will help you in a day where something isn't right. And I've seen this before. It might be some sort of corruption in the FMC with a legs waypoint. It's better to maintain these habits so that on a day where all of a sudden you lose a lot of track miles and you're high, you have a basket of tools available to you to be able to correct it in a timely fashion. I guess this leads into an idea of really how there's no such thing as a perfect computer, and although 737s are old technology, the plane was designed, developed in the 60s, and it's had progressive upgrades since then, but for the most part they're still computers and they can still fail. There's an old saying, rubbish in, rubbish out. And this is the same even if you're flying a Garmin. which is, you know, more of an elementary sort of general aviation tool for navigation. Depending on what you put in, as well as the navigation database, which is like the Google Earth inside the software system, there's always going to be room for errors and corruption and issues that the FMC isn't even aware of a lot of the time. Sometimes it is, sometimes it just falls outside the envelope of what it knows it can do, and it gives you a helpful hand by saying, hey, I can't do this, you take over. But for the most part, these tools are really awesome, and so long as you sort of understand the fundamentals of how they calculate their tops of descent, the inputs that are required, such as what speed you're descending at, any altitude constraints, speed constraints, they are incredible tools. The only other thing I was going to talk about, and also relates to energy management, is the RNP Victor into Melbourne, and how simply it's got a different glide path angle. It's I believe a 4 degree or higher glide path before you get to what the equivalent of the initial approach fix is. Then it shallows out to about 3.5 degrees. But the consideration for that is that this aeroplane, the 7.3, it's really designed for a 3 degree glide path. And if you were to get to the initial fix, which is the start of an instrument approach, and that's the point you would normally really start configuring, maybe just prior. And if you all of a sudden have a 4 degree profile, which is at the same point where you would normally be starting to configure, and you haven't configured at all, this sort of leads back to our total energy discussion about, okay, now we've got a more aggressive, steeper descent path. The aeroplane doesn't necessarily account for that in its deceleration. And because of that general awareness, you would start to configure earlier. Because what would happen if you just arrived at an initial approach fix that was for an approach that was at 4 degrees descent path rather than 3 degrees, a lot shallower, the aeroplane is going to be maintaining speed. You will not be able to slow down. So that's it for energy management. Pretty long day, almost 11 hours, I think, if you factor everything in. I hope some of that energy chat was useful, and until the next one, have a great day. See you in the next video.